Good morning, and welcome back to Introduction to Psychology. And in this lecture, we're going to start our exploration of Chapter 1 of the text, which is on psychology, what is the discipline, and psychology as a science. So some updates first. There is a copy of the textbook on 3-hour reserve at the library. What that means is that if you, for some reason, can't purchase a copy of the text for yourself, you can go and borrow it for 3 hours. You can't take it out of the library, but that's one way that you can access the content. I posted the video of the Class 1 lecture. That was my first time ever recording a lecture in Teams. And I noticed that the sound quality was really tinny. And when I thought about things and turned my head to the side, it lost the audio. And so I've now have a better microphone, and I hope we'll have a better quality recording. What I didn't know if your chats were going to come up. And in fact, they did not. So your chats are saved in Teams, but they're not in the video lecture. And so in order to make so that people who are watching the lecture without the chat aren't confused, I will probably read your chat so that before I answer, so that people who are listening later on know what I'm responding to. I also found that it was very easy to cover up participating students to protect your privacy. I just added a black square. So that was easier than expected. The gradebook has now been set up in Moodle. And I want to share an interesting opportunity with you. The psychology department has a colloquia, which I think is really exciting. And the next one is on January the 20th at 3 p.m. or 1500 hours. And it is on the subject of exercise and depression. And there's a research article that's associated that the speaker sent out. And I posted it on Moodle under the articles that have been provided by the previous instructor as examples of articles that could you use to sort of write up one of the research credits. So to recap from last lecture, 5% of your final grade comes from research participation, and you can do that as credits for participating in research studies that are posted on SONA, and you get 0.5% per half hour of volunteering, or you can submit summaries of articles, and each summary is worth 1%. And so that's going to the colloquium, I think, is a good opportunity to network. And I'm going to be going. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to meeting other folks in the psychology department. And I think that could be a fun way to get that done. So here's the, oh, no, sorry, my clicker's not working. How convenient. So here is the paper that the speaker sent out that I posted on Moodle. Exercise reduces depression and inflammation, but intensity matters. And this is the speaker. So the colloquium speaker is one of the authors on that article. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Jennifer Heiss. She's a Canada Research Chair in Brain Health and Aging. She's an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University, and she's the director of the NeuroFit Lab. And she recently wrote a book called Move the Body, Heal the Mind. So here's a peek of the results of the study, and I'm wondering what you guys might see in that graph. So the authors are looking at depression, anxiety, and perceived stress. And what do we see in that graph? So there's a score here on some kind of a depression scale, and a higher score would mean more depression than a lower score. And what this is showing in this graph is change. So in one of these groups, the depression scores went way up, and in one of the groups of the study, it looks like it went down. And so this was a study where they randomized students, university students, to 3 groups. And so in the control group, people were asked to stay sedentary and not exercise. And what happened to the depression, anxiety, and stress of those students in the control group who stayed sedentary? Yeah, it went up. And you can look at the size of the change there. So the if you look at the graphs, they're standardized. And you can see that the depression score went way up, right? And the anxiety went up too, and the stress went up too, but not as much. And yes, Chance, it's high intensity. So so being sedentary, think of depression behaviorally. Like, let's not think of it right now as the thoughts in your head, but just think of it as the behavior of your body when somebody's depressed, right? They've got no energy, right? They're slouching. Their exercise is kind of the opposite of that. So it makes sense that if you ask people to stay sedentary, probably slumped over their desk in a library, that they'd feel more depressed too. Now, if we look at the title of the study, why does this not work? It looked so cool. I'll have to click. Exercise reduces depression and inflammation, but intensity matters. Intensity matters. And so in one of the exercise group, it's moderate, it's a moderate amount of exercise. And in one of the groups, it says high intensity training. Yeah, so Jane's saying that high intensity training isn't for everyone, but some find it useful. And that's really important to note in psychology, because sometimes you can get a general result for a group of people, and that's not what some particular individual needs. Yeah, so Jacob said that HIIT can be very intense and fast-paced, which might be stressful. And so look at that graph on perceived stress. Okay, so stress went up for the sedentary group, went way up for the people in the high intensity interval training, and it went down for the folks with the moderate exercise. And the moderate intensity continuous training was about like half an hour of exercise per day. That's a good point, Chance. Intense could look different for different people. And then what do we see for anxiety? If you look at anxiety, the result for the high intensity training is so close to 0, and look at the size of the error bars around that. Looking at that, I'd probably say it made no difference to anxiety. Made people feel more stressed. And then, so what do you see for the depression scores for the moderate continuous training versus the high intensity? Yes, Jacob, they decreased in both. And then was there one that looked, the error bars are overlapping there. Yeah, so it went down in both, and I haven't read the paper yet. I will do so. It's looking from the graph like the moderate intensity was a bit more effective, but the size of the error bars there are showing that. Sorry, how do I explain the error bars? There might be so much overlap that's not a statistically significant difference. And I have a chat from one of the students saying that they can't see what I'm showing the class. So I know that some of you can see my slides, which I'm sharing because you're able to talk to me about the graph that I'm showing. Okay, yeah, try leaving and rejoining. And if you can't see the slides, they will be on the recording, and you can always watch later. I'm going to, a student said that doing a workout will cause stress in the moment, and you transfer stress you can't combat into a physical force you can apply. Wow, that's a very powerful way of thinking, of leveraging your resources. Stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Stress can be toxic. Like the stress of being discriminated against can be, or of having folks gang up on you, that can be a really scary, bad kind of stress. But the stress of exercise, the stress of rising to a challenge isn't necessarily bad for you. All right, so how am I going to run the next 3 lectures? So according to the course syllabus, which we'll be covering chapter 1 over 3 lectures, this one and the next 2. As you know, this was designed by another instructor, so I'm trying to go along with that. And the slide deck has 60-ish slides, and there's 3 classes, so I'm going to try to get through 20-ish slides today. So I'll start with the big question of, what is psychology? What is this discipline that that you're studying here today? So the definition that your book gives you is that it's the scientific study of the mind, brain, and behavior. And I really wish they put a comma after brain. There's a few big concepts packed in there. Mika joked that it's a nasty little subject. Yes, it was called out by one of its founders. So what does it mean that it's scientific? Like, what's a scientific discipline? So it's the scientific study of the mind, brain, and behavior. What does that mean? Scientific, give me an idea. Yes. So we use the scientific method is an approach to doing things. We try to be systematic. We try to be as objective as we can. We try to replicate our findings. We have a certain kind of accountability to the evidence. Yes, Owen, it is empirical. Yes, Laura, we do research that we then try to replicate and communicate. Yes, Ruby, it takes an approach using the scientific method. Gotham, excellent question. Is it unbiased? We try to be unbiased. Ideally, we are unbiased, but humans are biased. We all have, our political worldviews, our values. We have different positionalities, and we understand the world from our social locations. And so when psychologists try to understand the world, what they write up thinking is objective might actually reflect a lot of their own personal biases and social location. But discernment is best done in community so that we can act as a check on each other's own self-deception. And so when we communicate our ideas and research in good faith, if we're inclusive and there's lots of different folks at the table, they can help us understand and be aware of our biases. And now I'm just going to scroll up because there's a bunch of questions. Yes, Jacob, we're trying to answer questions, but in a way that reflects the scientific method. So we have a particular approach to doing that. And yes, Mika, it is absolutely impossible to be unbiased, but there are ways to check that, to try to be aware of our own biases, and also to include others, communicate in good faith so that we can kind of identify biases and work them out. Yes, Kennedy. So we try to generate. If we have a theory, a good theory is one that will generate hypotheses, and those hypotheses should have a testable prediction, and that acts as a kind of BS check on our theory. And Chance wrote, I heard last term that only 10% of psychological findings yield positive results. The rest are inconclusive or negative. And Yeah, so there's something called publication bias, and if someone does a study, even if it's well done, and there's a null result, then nobody really wants to publish that because the academic journals all want to publish these sexy breakthroughs, and people want to author those. And so the study with null result gets kind of put away. That's called the file draw problem. And then people who get a positive result, and by positive I mean it looks like there's something going on. Oh, we found an effect. Well, then that's exciting, and that gets published. But it was really just a chance finding, because in psychology, in science, there's an effect of chance. Things happen haphazardly, and that happens in psychology too. And sometimes you get a result and it's really a fluke, or it's so contextual and context specific that it doesn't really generalize. And then we have a bunch of studies that that show some positive result, but that if you try to replicate them, often they don't. So that is true chance, and that's a good kind of it's a piece of humility for the field. I think there is a lot of overstatement in psychology and a lot of overgeneralization, and often a positivist and modernist perspective that doesn't understand social context very well, that doesn't understand that this result was found in a particular place in the world, in a particular time, in a particular demographic of people. And there's a social psychologist, Kenneth Gergen, who said that, in a way, psychology is history. Because if you did some kind of test on, let's say, the well-being of queer folks in 1970, will be a lot different than from now, wouldn't it? So is that, about those people and their psychology, or does context really matter and matter a lot? So often there's an undervaluing of context, even to the point of being context blind. And I'm reading the chats right now. Yes, Mika, negative results are telling and informative, and we should be publishing them. So that is a limitation of the discipline. It's about culture, and I hope that if you go forward in psychology, you can address some of the issues in your time. All right, so we know what science is now. So it's a scientific discipline, and it's the study of the mind, brain, and behavior. What is the mind? What does that mean? The mind can mean pain, yes. That's another kind of big question. What is the mind? What do you mean by that? What it means has changed over history. Yeah, so chance, it can include your personality. The brain in action. And that thought processes, the conscious thoughts. Depends if we're speaking biologically or conceptually. The emotions and processes of the brain. The actions of the brain, thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensation. And the answer is yes, all of the above. Psychology is a crossover discipline between philosophy and biology. That's why I think it's so great that some of you folks are arts majors that are studying some form of philosophy, classics, gender and women's studies. And so mind is a big word, and originally it meant soul. And the first person to call himself a psychologist was Wilhelm Wundt, and he redefined the study of the discipline as consciousness instead of the soul. And if you look at what is included in your consciousness, well, then it's all sorts of things, like the things you were mentioning. It's memory, it's sensation. Personality refers to the type of actions you take. We'd expect that an extrovert is the one that's sort of speaking up and raising their hand in class and going to the parties. Okay, so the kind of actions that you're aware of and that you intentionally make. But there's also an unconscious mind. right? So it's not just consciousness. So Wundt, he made a big contribution, and your conscious awareness is absolutely part of your mind, but it's not the whole story, right? The unconscious mind is very real. Freud had some wacky ideas about it, but he was onto something. All right. And another thing that came up in your comments was that it's kind of about the behavior that your brain produces. And that represents a big step in the history of science and technology, because what did the Egyptians think, the ancient Egyptians? Did they believe that? Did they think your consciousness had anything to do with your brain? What did they do with the brains of the mummies? Because exactly. So, as Calvin says, they believed that the seat of your mind, that your mind was in your heart. Yeah, they just scooped the brain out and threw it away, and then they put all the really important organs into these like canopic jars, so that the mummy, the deceased king, could take these important organs with them and use them in the afterlife. But they didn't think the brain was one of them. Okay, they just chucked that out. Yeah, they believed that the heart would be weighed after death against a feather, and if it was, I guess, the right weight, you'd go to the good place, and if it wasn't, you'd go to the bad place. So that's a modern advance in science to understand that your consciousness is associated with your brain, not your heart. Psychology looks at issues through different levels of analysis, and different psychologists and different fields of psychologists use different levels of analysis. I think it's really important to be able to think about them all, because we can get really focused on one particular level of analysis and then forget about the others. And so let's take a psychological issue like depression. If you were to look at depression at the biological lowest level of analysis, what might you be thinking of? If you're looking at studies that took a biological perspective on depression, what questions might they be asking? So it's not the psychological level. It's not about what you're thinking or feeling. Excellent. Yes. Hormones. Chemical hormonal changes. Do brain chemical levels influence depression rates? Chances suggesting the molecular level, like dopamine, serotonin reuptake. Yes. Yeah. Genetic predisposition. What's your family history? What receptors in the neuron are active? Exactly. Yeah, you guys got it. So it's the genetic level. It's the level of looking at things like neurotransmitters. Yeah. Could exposure to any kind of chemical influence that mood? So you guys are on it. Now, let's say you're a psychologist studying depression at the psychological level. What's under your microscope then? So if you're a psychologist and you're now using the middle level, what kind of things might you be looking at in your client? Yeah. So Jacob says how people with depression feel and how they act. And so what kind of feelings does a person with depression have? And what kind of thoughts? What kind of actions? Okay, so numbness. So, and Emily's saying that, well, that they seem depressed, but tell me how would you describe that? Okay, so a feeling you might have, Vern says, is hopelessness. That's true. Sometimes no feelings. Yeah, numbness. So when you're talking about sort of fatigue, we're describing behavior. So what would the depressed person look like? They look really tired. And Anger is a positive emotion. The reason it's positive is that it activates you towards your goals. And there's a healthy way to use your anger. But sometimes if people are in really difficult social circumstances and very subordinated position, there's no socially appropriate way for them to express their anger. And that can turn into resentment and be very sort of discouraging and eat away at you. They can be sensitive to rejection, a sinking feeling, not having the motivation to do anything, sorrowfulness, not enjoying things anymore that they once enjoyed. And excellent observation from Gotham that they might look like a normal person. Right? People can feel these things and actually choose not to express them in their behavior. Yeah, they might look malnourished if they're not eating enough. And then a comment from Emily saying not leaving your room, staying in bed, and a qualification that she meant, anger that's self-directed. Yes, there's anger can be expressed as resentment when somebody is in a social context where they can't, there's no healthy outlet for their anger. In power relationships, it's generally considered inappropriate for a subordinate person to be angry. Anger is considered appropriate for sort of dominant people. So I could be the angry teacher in this class, but you're more likely to be the resentful student and not talk about the issues because you might be afraid that I'd retaliate against you. So I'm kind of suggesting that social cultural level there. So in a way, you can see how it continues to be important even at the psychological level. They might feel abandoned and rejected. The chemical balance is going back to the biological level. You might see bad hygiene. You might see that. There might be self-hatred. They could, and then you mentioned anxiety there, and anxiety is different from depression, but in fact, they're very highly correlated. So if you think of like being wound up worrying about things, right, that could take a lot of energy, and then you get tired out. And some folks with depression engage in self-harm. That's that sort of inwardly directed anger. So you guys got it. Now we're going to do the hardest thing ever. This is hard for a lot of folks in psychology. It's going to be easier for some of you folks from more marginalized groups to do this. We're going to move up to the level of social and culture. How would you look at depression then? So we're moving up to the social and cultural level of depression. We're talking about something in an individual, but we're now thinking about society and culture. I see comments are coming quickly and sort of faster. They're going faster than I can read them. So I'm going to scroll up here. Calvin, I don't quite understand the question. Does the behavior cause depression? No, when we're looking at depressed behavior. Oh, I see your point, Calvin. Yeah. So if you act in ways that seem sort of depressed, like if you force yourself to frown, if you force yourself to be sedentary, then you're more likely to actually become depressed. So yes, Calvin, there can be there is a feedback loop there. There's a comment about introversion. Introversion is at the psychological level within the individual. It's about personality. Cultural attitudes around mental health. Excellent, Jane. Yes, that's what we'd be thinking of. Can you give me an example of some cultural attitudes? Gotham said isolation. If we're at the social and cultural level, what does that mean? Is it about the person isolating themselves? What's the society or the culture doing to them? Okay, so see how it's harder to think at this level? Generational trauma, absolutely yes. Identity and relationships with others. Yes, at the social level, we'll be thinking about relationships with other folks. Looking at things through the lenses of experiences particular to race, LGBTQ, women, and marginalized groups. Absolutely, yes, that's this level. Is it about looking at how the community or society views depression? Absolutely. Stigma? Yes. Big, big yes. I was talking to my friend's mom, who was a psychiatric nurse. And since I'm a vocational psychologist, what I love to do is talk to people about their jobs and their their work and what they did and what it was like. And so she was telling me what it was like at this psychiatric inpatient hospital in Cape Breton. And I was asking her what kind of clients she saw and what the patients were like. And she told me about a sort of a severely depressed man. And I asked, well, what caused that? And she said, well, he was gay. This was maybe back in the 70s when homosexuality was listed as a mental illness under the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So that was the kind of thing that happened in the 1970s. But now discrimination still exists. So you can be gay and actually have a life and be functioning. And that's not. Is that about the person? Really, where is the solution at the personal level, at the biological level? Is it to give that person an SSRI, right? Is it to try to help them change their feelings? Maybe the answer there was changing culture around them. That's hard to do, and it's also hard to see. I'm going to keep reading the comments. Yes, homelessness and addiction would absolutely contribute to that. You're still. We want to. No, I'm going to go with yes, though. Those are at the social level. Absolutely being part of a marginalized group. How's it viewed in the community? Yeah, people who are discriminated against. I think I'm reading through your comments quickly, and I see a question from Kennedy. Would self-harm be considered social cultural influences because it's a behavior? It'd be psychological. Self-harm itself is at the psychological level, okay, because it's behavior, but the cause of that behavior might be at any one of those three levels. And in fact, the different levels interact with each other. Okay. And yes, chat. So ASD is autism spectrum disorder. So maybe that doesn't itself cause depression, but the way we treat people with autism could certainly be upsetting. Absolutely, Jacob. Familial influences are at that level too. Parental expectations. Yes. The way other people perceive us. Another comment about stigma. Gotham, you're still thinking at the psychological level. So you're saying the person isolating themselves because they don't feel part of the group. That's putting it on the person. If you're going to the social or cultural level, I want you to think about how are the other people treating that person. And of course, there's going to be an interaction. Yeah, so, and there's a comment from Ruby about biases that people around you might have that lead to denial, deepening of depression symptoms. And those biases would reflect culture. So you're good. You're thinking at the cultural level. Yeah, privilege is a cultural thing. Family. It's a question, the individual be treated because they act different. Yep. That goes back to culture. So good. I'm seeing you guys at the cultural level now, thinking about social standards and norms. Not being able to perform in a way that's viewed as expected in society due to depression and being looked down on or treated badly for not being able to perform. That's a brilliant comment, Shelby. Actually, folks with if you look at the cluster of behaviors that's called depression, and then it's the whole cluster of things, right? And some of those are like basically tiredness, and a strong predictor of depression is lack of sleep. But a lot of the other stuff, like being critical and seeming hopeless, you could look at them through a strengths-based perspective and say, maybe these folks are really good at critical analysis, right? And getting to the bottom of complex social problems. And there's actually there should be space in society for people who are critics. We know that from social psychology, that you always need a skeptic on the group. Otherwise, people get into something called groupthink. And so some of us have that skeptical disposition naturally. And it's important and there should be a place for it. But we're kind of looking at this through a really negative lens. And then when you say hopelessness, hopelessness in what? Or feeling burdened. I mean, if we sort of flip that around, if somebody's feeling burdened by stuff, what do they value? Maybe they value freedom. Okay, we're looking at all of these things through a very dark lens, and so the diagnosis of depression, the construct of depression itself reflects society and culture. Okay, we're not taking a strengths-based view of the skills and the values. I'm going to read the messages again. Yeah, it can definitely make you feel bad about yourself if you compare yourself to others. And a really dysfunctional way to compare yourself to others is to take one particular trait, right? You're always going to find somebody who has more of that. And so you could feel bad about yourself, right? If, let's say you're a pretty smart person. Well, there's always somebody who has higher IQ score. If you're a good looking person, there's always somebody else that, right? Like you can just, that game doesn't go anywhere good. And in fact, I would advocate for separating your sense of self-worth from your behavior and your performances so that you have unconditional self-worth. All right, I'm going to keep reading the messages. So stigma, peer pressure. Keith, overthinking things is at the psychological level, and that's, again, that skill of critical analysis. Yeah. Olivia has a comment that, so if people with depression have less energy and they might not have poor hygiene, then that is judged. Yes. And yes, so a chance Scandinavian cultures do have better happiness scores, and they do have more egalitarian cultures as well. That is true. All right, so I will continue with the lecture so we don't run out of time here, but it was great to see you guys moving and kind of unsticking from that psychological level and getting up to the social and cultural level. So there are some challenges in psychology, 5 main psychology. So behavior is difficult to predict because there isn't just one cause. If somebody is depressed, it's probably not because of just one thing. Is it the way they're sleeping? Is it their diet? Is it discrimination? Do they have dysfunctional thoughts? Could it be all of the above? And do all of these things interact with each other? So psychological, those influences are not even independent from each other. So you can see how complicated this science is. And then, we often do a study and we give an average result for a group of people. And yet we're all individuals and we have, we're all very unique. And we're trying to generalize those results back to predict an individual's behavior. But maybe that study doesn't apply to them so well. People also influence each other because we live together in society, and the way that we behave reflects the way that people treat us, and the way they act reflects on the way that we treat them. And our behavior also reflects our culture. And we can study culture using emic versus etic approaches. Emic, the M is like for me, is studying a culture from an insider's view. So if I were to discuss academic culture, and then an etic approaches from an outsider's view. And so that would be like if somebody who was a non-academic came into a university to study academic culture, we might have different perspectives and notice different things. Sometimes folks think that psychology is all common sense, and it's not, because we have a lot of biases. And one of our biggest biases is thinking that we're right. Our perceptions are heavily constructed in a lot of ways. Even our memories can be quite quite constructed, but we believe that they're true. We might believe that our memories are like a snapshot or like a video recording. So consider that the Earth seems flat to our perception, but it's really not. Here's an example from the textbook. A lot of people would think that that hat is longer than it's wide, but if you take out your ruler, the brim is actually, right, the length of the brim is greater than the vertical length, but your brain is biased to interpret that the vertical line as longer. So psychology is a science, as you guys know, and as you all said in the chat before, it's a way of looking at things. So it's not a body of knowledge. It's a way of observing and interpreting evidence. So psychology is a science. It's one where we use the scientific method and value critical thinking, but it's not quite the same kind of science as chemistry or physics. And I keep a pack of salt with me in my purse because I have to explain this to people so often. And so if you consider, something as objective as salt. All right, I can't find it now. But imagine sort of a pack of salt. Imagine some salt. That's a really objective thing to study. You could study it chemically, be like it's sodium chloride. We all taste it and agree that it's salt, right? There's not a lot of argument about that. And that's a hard science. But what we study in psychology is of a far more abstract and philosophical nature. And what we're studying are often constructs. Like depression is a construct, okay? It doesn't have the same, I can hold up the sort of pack of salt. Well, I can't hold your depression in my hand in the same way. I can't put it under a microscope in the same way. And so the constructs that we study are often social constructs. Right? They're ideas. The diagnosis of a depression is an idea. It's an assessment. It's a theory. You can't hold it in your hand or weigh it on a scale, right? Like you could with a pack of salt. You could use a rating scale about people's feelings and see if the scores are higher or lower, but there's way more like variance in the way people interpret the questions, compared to the kind of variance that you get when you put a pack of salt on the scale and it pretty much always weighs like, say, 1 gram, right? The way that somebody answers a question on a rating scale with a 1 to 5, that's a much kind of more subjective type of a measure. Right? And you can't sort of chemically analyze it like you can with salt. There's no blood test for depression. And there's a belief that depression is caused by low serotonin, which I think has been debunked. There's a meta-analytic study on it that's out. Okay, you can't look at it through a microscope. And so we study a lot of vague, fuzzy, shifting, subjective concepts like well-being. They don't have an objective existence like the salt does. But your well-being is still important to you. And when I say well-being, you know what I'm talking about, abstractly, generally. But it's a philosophical concept, and there's a lot of disagreement about what well-being is. Right? So we have to be, so we're a science that is limited by subjectivity and context, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a cool thing. So laws in psychology aren't like the law of gravity, right? They're more like guidelines. They're not as reliable as or universal as the law of gravity. If I drop this pen, right, it's going to fall down. It doesn't really matter what country I'm in or what time period, it's always going to do that. But the sort of principles in psychology might only work some of the time or in some places or in some people. Okay, and a lot of the research that we do in psychology is based on experiment with undergraduate students in Western countries who represent a really particular demographic. They're not done on universal global humanity across all places and times, but we often talk as if they do. So there's no objective physiological tests for at least most mental illness, right? So a blood test will show that someone has diabetes or vitamin C deficiency, but there's no blood test for ADHD. It's an assessment that someone makes in the framework of a theory. It's quite philosophical. If you went to, I was watching an interview with hunter-gatherers, and if you tried to explain ADHD to them, it would just make absolutely no sense, because that's based on classroom learning in Western countries and the way that we structure classrooms. Can you see how important social context is? Okay, so there's a really important role of context, of culture, of systems, of power relationships, and of social construction. But when we're in the system and we have that emic perspective, it's actually really hard to see the system. And sometimes we need people from outside our systems to describe them and look in, and we can learn from that. So if you're into arts and philosophy and religion, you'll find lots of things to relate to in psychology. You can get a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. I don't know about Mount A, but you can at many places. You cannot get a Bachelor of Arts in say, chemistry or physics. And sorry, my slides are not turning. I don't think I like this slide turner. So there is, as we were talking about before, there's, especially on the social side of psychology and the practice of psychology, there's a lot of Western philosophy, right? And, the idea of what is normal, that's heavily socially constructed, okay? Vocational psychology has a lot of Christian concepts like talent, passion, discernment, calling, even the word vocation. Can you see that, how it's sort of soaked in that history? There's a lot of metaphor and symbolism, and especially in personality psychology. Take artistic license in constructing narratives. There's appeal to myth and allegory. You'll find that in, say, Freud's Oedipus complex, which goes back to classical mythology. There's a role for storytelling, and psychologists often do things that are, clinical judgment, and that means intuition. So a scientific theory is an explanation for a large number of findings in the natural world. So a good theory should make testable predictions. We do that by making a hypothesis. And if a non-scientific theory will not generate falsifiable predictions. So a good prediction is falsifiable because you can't prove a theory, okay? You can't. You can only disprove it. So it's like the best theories are the last ones standing. There are many misconceptions about theories. There's a lay use of the term theory. So like my theory of why my boyfriend broke up with me is a lay use of the term. And I don't want to knock the lay use of the term too hard. But in science, a theory doesn't explain just one thing. It explains a set of observation. And the good theories that we have are the ones that have survived a lot of this kind of shit testing. Oh, I have a mistake in my slide. It says theories can be proven. It's supposed to say can't. That is a mistake. Okay, that's a typo. So theories can only be disproven or falsified. And so an unscientific theory is an unfalsifiable theory. We have many of our own biases as psychologists that can make it hard to test our theories because we have a tendency to look for the evidence that supports our hypothesis, right? We kind of see what we want to see, and we might overlook distorting evidence or contrary evidence. And I think that's, why it's so important to be inclusive and to allow other people to participate in the discipline so that they can act as a check on that tendency to self-deception. And belief perseverance means that we have if we want to believe something, it's really hard to let go. It's really hard to unlearn things that aren't true. Okay. There's an argument in your textbook that there are some things that lie beyond the boundaries of science, and ethical questions like, what's a good life, right? Science doesn't really tell you about, say, moral values. You sort of just decide which ones are good. But, this is an idea, and it can be criticized. Like, is it really true that you can't test religious belief? Well, there have been research on intercessory prayer, and there's one study that found a positive effect, and then I found another study that found no effect. So, that's an argument. But when you look at, you could scientifically study a matter of moral philosophy, and well-being is a matter of moral philosophy. So I'm noticing that the time is 10:20, and we made it to slide 21. So I think we stayed on track. And I'm going to stay on here, and I'm going to stop the recording now and read through your comments. Thank you for your attention.